Welcome to the Kindle Chronicles. Today is February 21st. It's my grandson James's birthday. He's 14 today. And I am recording this at the Bally's Casino and Hotel in Las Vegas, Nevada. It's tough for a New Englander to get the name of that state right the way the locals say it. Darlene and I have been knocking on doors and doing other work for a political candidate here in preparation for the caucuses on Saturday. And I need to get this up right now this morning because I'm about to do duty today driving members of the campaign staff to different locations here in the Las Vegas area the day before the caucuses. So I was fortunate to be able to record an interview for this episode that I really am glad to bring to you, and I hope you'll find useful. I spoke with A G Riddle on Saturday, February 15th, before Darlene and I left for Las Vegas. And Jerry writes best-selling thrillers based on science, including a novel titled Pandemic that he published in April of 2017. That was the first of two novels in his Extinction Files series. As with all of his books, this one was based on extensive research, specifically in the crucial work done by the Center for Disease Control and Prevention and the World Health Organization. That's why I reached out to Jerry last week to see if he would be willing to talk with us about the coronavirus, which is now named COVID-19. He took the time to do an interview with me during a visit with his family in Boiling Springs, North Carolina. That's about 75 miles southeast of Asheville. And I began by asking when he started his research for the writing of Pandemic.
Yeah, I mean, it started shortly after the book before that came out, which was Departure. And I think Departure came out in December of 2014. So it was, early 2015. It took me about 2 years to do the research for the book. And I mean, that was, the plotting, the characters, but also the story research, the CDC, WHO type stuff.
Did you have any experience with CDC, WHO, pandemics before that?
No, not a ton of experience with infectious diseases. I worked in college. I went to college at UNC in Chapel Hill, and I worked at UNC hospitals and clinical trials. So, we routinely did trials on, viruses, pretty harmless, non-lethal viruses. We would, do trials for potential treatments, but, had never had a lot of experience in an outbreak setting. But the great news is, in the day and age we live in, you can find, YouTube videos with people who worked there and had actually gone through it, which was really instructive for me. And there's a lot of case literature out there, which is really helpful.
I remember when we talked last, the sense that you really respected the work that people do all the time, being ready for one of these outbreaks, and that if they do their work well, you never hear about them, and then if something dramatic happens, they get in the public eye and frequently get criticized. But is that kind of an overall sense you have of the people that are on the front lines of this virus?
Definitely. I mean, the public health workers that fight infectious diseases, are really putting their lives at risk. And it's, if you look at the number of public health workers who've died in China during this outbreak, I mean, the number is huge, and the number infected is huge. And you're not having bullets shot at you, but in a literal sense, you're putting yourself in harm's way every day. I mean, you're interacting with stuff that can make you sick, can kill you, can harm your family, and you're doing it for strangers. And I think there's something really extraordinary about that. And oftentimes these folks are traveling to places that are very dangerous. Rural Africa and rural Southeast Asia are not, these are not hotspot vacation destinations for these folks. So they're, they're not in Kabul, but they're certainly in places that they wouldn't choose to be in if not for the work, if not for, what's a very dangerous situation, their work.
Well, let's sketch the context, or really the history of this new virus. It looks like they've renamed it COVID-19, which I guess is a specific kind of coronavirus. Let's start there. Actually, what's the significance of giving it a new name?
Well, I'm frankly very surprised they've waited this long. I mean, I think it should have been done a lot sooner, and I think the historical context is important. They didn't want to name this. The name that was sort of emerging was Wuhan coronavirus or Wuhan COV, and it certainly sort of stigmatizes the Wuhan, the city and the region there, and we sort of learned from that with the Spanish flu, which now we refer to as the 1919 flu epidemic, and so I think they've tried to be sensitive to that, and COVID-19 is certainly an appropriate name. It seems to imply that there might be a COVID-20, and that I read into it, and the authorities think that this is probably a virus that's going to be with us for a while. It's going to persist, and there's probably going to be an annual variant, and it may be that in the future, you're going in for your COVID and flu vaccine, and every year we're looking at what's the variant of COVID that's prevalent this season. You vaccinate for it, and you sort of deal with anything new that pops up.
And that appears to be a likely scenario just because it's spreading so quickly?
That's correct. I mean, I think, so the way you approach this, so let's take Ebola, for example, because there's, a lot of case literature and there's been a lot of successful containment. Ebola is there are a lot of strains of Ebola. I mean, so there's Ebola Zaire, which is the most deadly strain. It kills about 90% of people who contract it. And then there's Ebola Sudan, which is less lethal. And then there are other viral hemorrhagic fevers like Marburg and Rift Valley, which, are not as deadly. But, Ebola takes about 2 to 21 days to present symptoms. I mean, this varies from host to host. But the great news about Ebola is that during the asymptomatic period, the person is not contagious. So they're walking around, they have Ebola, the Ebola virus is replicating within their body, but they're really not passing it on to other people that they come into contact with. And then when someone presents with Ebola symptoms, they're pretty stark. I mean, they're bleeding, they're hemorrhaging, and they generally become very sick, and dehydration becomes the principal worry. So when we talk about COVID-19, we think the asymptomatic period is up to 2 weeks. I mean, there's really a lot that's unknown, but they're pretty sure that during this asymptomatic period, hosts are contagious. So this is really a worst-case scenario. This means that there could be a lot of people walking around who have COVID-19, who are passing it along. They're going to Starbucks, they're going to airports, they're going to bars and restaurants, and leaving these viral particles everywhere they go that could be picked up. And by the way, we think that COVID-19 survives on fomites. So these are hard surfaces, your clothes, you can get it through a handshake. It's not clear whether it's airborne yet. And so I think that those are really important notes, because if you're talking about contact tracing for Ebola, so what they do is when someone presents with Ebola, they say, all right, this person has Ebola. They put them into isolation. Then they do contact tracing, and you say, well, this person in the last 21 days has come into contact with 200 people. Then they put those 200 people into quarantine, and they see who then develops Ebola, and then they repeat the process. And so your contact tree just gets bigger and bigger. And so the great thing is that Ebola is not very readily communicable. But COVID-19, so now you have 2 weeks of asymptomatic period where, it's really communicable. They came into contact with tons of people, and it's just really impossible to track down all those people. And some of these people, West Africa, where most Ebola outbreaks have been recently, there's not a ton of international air travel, not like there is out of a major city in China. And that's what makes this a lot different. I mean, if you're talking about containing this virus coming out of Hong Kong or Tokyo, I mean, those are just sort of insurmountable tasks in the day and age we live in.
Right. I heard someone talking about the definition of a pandemic as being an outbreak which is propagating on every continent. Have we reached that point yet with COVID-19?
Yes, and I think there reticent to use the word pandemic because it feels very scary. I mean, the pandemic differentiation is how regional is it, right? Outbreaks are localized events, and pandemics are global events. And we've got cases in Europe and America, and there's probably infected people everywhere now. The big problem with the virus is that it looks like it's very tough to tell if the information coming out of China is correct or not, or what to read into it. But it looks like about 80% of cases present as mild flu, cold and flu, which is great news. I mean, 80% of the people are not going to get very sick. But on the other side of that is, there's probably a lot of COVID cases that, are not diagnosed as COVID. And then people say, well, I got a mild cold. I'm going to go into work and, I'll get over it.
And that's a bad idea, given that this is afoot. People should be much more cautious about those kinds of symptoms and not spreading them, I guess.
That's right. I mean, the other 20% is where the problem lies, and it looks like, I can't remember the percentage, but it looks like a reasonable percentage of those, maybe a sixth, 16% or so, develop into pneumonia, which requires hospitalization. And it looks to me like, if I had to guess, I would say that those hospitalizations are what is being counted as the coronavirus case count in China, which makes sense. I mean, they can't go survey every apartment building and say, do you have have respiratory symptoms, and then they can't administer the COVID test, and it's a waste of resources, because if 80% of people are going to resolve with just home confinement, then there's no sense in dedicating resources when you got a lot of critical cases.
Now, the mortality rate appears to be about 1%.
Yeah, I mean, there's different numbers floating around. I've seen anywhere from 1% to 3%, but that is like. The numbers can be tricky, especially very early in an outbreak or pandemic, because you don't actually know the number of cases. So you know the number of people who died, but you don't know the number of people who were infected with the disease. So if you want to say, okay, 3% of those hospitalized cases ended in death, I think that's useful information. And then you have to sort of make some sort of estimation of, all right, how many people who were exposed to this virus went on to become hospitalized. And then from there you can say, okay, of all the people who were exposed to the virus, here's how many die, right?
Right.
In America, we get a pretty good count on flu cases, because, the flu is pretty intense. It's not really a mild cold. People go to the doctor, they get, Tamiflu or some antiviral, and use a painkiller, and, it's logged. And America has a really reasonably well-developed healthcare system. I think, in China, things are a little different, and this virus is a little different. But either way, I've seen it compared to seasonal flu, but this feels to me a lot more lethal. I mean, and you're dealing with a population this is a novel coronavirus, so it's a population that's never seen anything like it. So their immune system, it's really a dice roll how it will react.
I was reading some history about the 1918-1919 influenza. That was a pandemic as well. And that the mortality rate there was about 1%, and 50 million people died. So depending on how many people are exposed to it, even what sounds like a pretty small mortality rate can have devastating effect.
That's correct. I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, you think about 1% being, gosh, that's pretty good odds, but it's really not. I mean, if you're talking about, there's 7 billion people on the planet, but you have to really think, well, who's living in a major urban metro or in an area where, the virus can really circulate and survive, and you're still talking about millions and millions of people in the world in modern times. I mean, since 1919, we haven't really seen anything like this. So I'm a little concerned, obviously.
Yeah. It seems like the possibility that it can also be airborne really has implications for air travel. Is that something that kind of a shoe that's about to drop if there's Because how would you ever dare fly in a plane if you thought that you could be exposing yourself to the virus that way?
Yeah, I mean, it is concerning. I mean, I think they need to figure out if it's airborne, and they need to do that really quickly. I mean, the airborne thing is kind of a double-edged sword. I mean, if it's a respiratory infection, the odds of it being airborne, frankly, I'll say I think they're pretty good, or at least warrant very serious investigation. And as far as I know, there's a lab in Australia that has grown COVID-19, and so they have something to work from, and they can start doing some testing. The airborne thing cuts both ways. I mean, there's a reason that flu is seasonal. I mean, the flu virus is airborne, and with the coming of spring and summer, viruses like the flu virus, they like the cold and they like dry air. Humid air, the moisture in the air tends to form droplets that bind the virus and take it down to the ground where it can't infect you or is less likely to. So spring and summer, generally for airborne viruses are bad news. They can still be, obviously communicated via fomites and things like that. But the other side is that, winter only comes once a year on each side of the planet, right? So, winter would be coming around to Australia and the southern hemisphere, just as COVID was maybe catching a tough break in the northern hemisphere, but more people live in the northern hemisphere, obviously.
Yeah. What about precautions? What are you, based on what what are you recommending for your family, and what's your practice to try to minimize the chances of running into COVID-19?
Well, I mean, what we're doing here is just, trying to we live in Raleigh, North Carolina, which is, a medium-sized city in the U.S. and not a huge international travel hub, but we're being a little more cognizant of, sanitizing our hands. We've been using, regular bar soap at home, but now we're using a little more germ-killing soap. Trying to touch your face less, I think, is important. And the other thing is, I think it looks like, children, mercifully seem to be more or less unaffected by COVID-19. I mean, that's an article I read. I think that's great news. Maybe because their immune systems aren't developed quite as much, and for whatever reason, the virus, their system either clears it or it's able, a child's immune system is building itself. Everything is a novel pathogen to them to some extent. I mean, you inherit some innate immunity from your parents, and but it looks like the older people, so I think older members of your family, anyone with a compromised immune system, and anyone who has any sort of underlying respiratory disorder, whether it be COPD or PVOD or something like that, should exercise extreme caution. And that might mean, if you're, getting on in age and have a serious respiratory condition, I would, if I were you, I would seriously consider, either limiting air travel and limiting some of these big events. Like my wife went to a Celine Dion concert last week, and she said, should I think about this? And I was like, no, I don't. You're 38 years old and reasonably healthy, and you want to see Celine Dion your entire life. So, there's no way I was going to answer in the negative to that. But I think reasonable precautions are warranted. And that, if you ask me what I think is the probable outcome, is a pretty major outbreak in the U.S. that, does take some lives, but eventually gets under control. And this is probably going to become part of our, part of everyday life. Like COVID virus is probably here to stay. I don't personally think the odds of containment are really that high, but I hope I'm wrong.
Yeah. Well, and I read recently that this season so far, there have been 10,000 deaths from regular flu in the U.S. So you sort of forget that these diseases are killing lots of people, even with flu shots and all the precautions we have. And hopefully COVID-19 becomes something that isn't maybe even as deadly as the regular flu that we deal with.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, look, the best case scenario, if I were in a room at the CDC, I think what you do is you try to slow it down and you wait until you get a vaccine, and then you try to vaccinate those at risk, those populations we just talked about. And then you look for treatments. It looks like there's a company, Gilead, an American pharmaceutical biotech company, that has an antiviral drug they developed for Ebola that looks to be effective against COVID. So buying time in cases like this is, really helpful. You're not going to be able to develop a drug and put it through trials fast enough, but you might find something on the shelf that is effective and you can use it. And that's kind of how you beat something like this. You slow it down, find a viable treatment, and then develop your vaccine, which will probably be here, if they really get to work. I mean, they might have it by, the end of this year, ready for next season.
A piece I heard on the BBC this morning talked about hand soap washing front and back and the web between the fingers. Is that hand soap seems to take more time than just sanitizer, where you just give a couple of squirts and you put it around your hand. But is there a case for hand soap as a preferable way to protect yourself from possible exposure?
Oh, yeah. I mean, hand soap, far preferable in my view. I think there's a lot of cases where it's impractical, and I think that is a use case for hand sanitizer. So, I know you've been in the air and on flights recently, and I think in those cases, just where you're going through check-ins, if you check in at the gate and check a bag or something, when the lady hands you your tickets, or if you pick up your cup of coffee at the Starbucks in the airport, those are times when you could use some hand sanitizer. And you're probably, you're doing a lot to decrease your exposure, because those are places where, tons of people coming through, and they've been all over the world, and it's, high likelihood of the virus being there.
I was impressed. My guest this week was Gary LaRue, who was headed to the Mobile World Congress in Barcelona, and that got canceled. He had sort of seen that there was talk of protocols. People weren't going to be shaking hands, and when I spoke with him earlier in the week, he thought it was possible that they canceled it. But that's 100,000 people that were going to be going to Barcelona, and it's just shut down. I wonder if South by Southwest gets canceled coming up in March.
It would not surprise me. I mean, I think I was not, after Amazon pulled out of Mobile World and a few other companies did, I was, I thought it was a good decision to cancel it. I mean, the reason is that you've got folks coming from areas where there's just a ton of cases. Mm-hmm. And South by Southwest, I think it's going to kind of depend on the number of cases in the U.S. and how cautious people are. But, it's a tough one. I mean, 2020 is going to be a tough year for conferences, I think.
Yeah. Let's see. What else was I going to ask you? Oh, face masks. Until we have more information about whether it's airborne, they're not indicated as much as making sure that the hands and the face are taken care of.
Yeah, that's right. And the face mask thing, I mean, how big are these viral particles? What's the, how big are the pores in the mask? And, sometimes the face mask thing is for the wearer something that makes them more comfortable or helps their stress level. I think they can be, I think they can be helpful in that sense. I think it can also freak a lot of people out, but if it turns out it's airborne, I think, face masks are certainly called for, especially for vulnerable populations.
Yeah. Do you think if what's known now about these outbreaks had been known in 1918, that instead of 50 million people dying, it would have been much less than that, just because they didn't really understand what they were dealing with then?
That's a good question. It's something I've never really thought about. I mean, in 1919, one of the big problems was that you had a virus that was a novel flu virus that was, they think that it, is a mix of chicken and swine DNA that altered a flu virus. They think this probably emerged from a pig somewhere in Western Europe around the end of the First World War. What you had a lot of soldiers that had been, congregated in Western Europe. They were doing trench warfare, and they got transported back home to the United States. And they were on a ship back then. They weren't flown home, and those viruses had time to amplify and get started, and then it just spread everywhere. I think back then, the big problem was the speed of information was far slower than it is today. I mean, today, every morning we wake up to a new virus count from China. Back then, in Oklahoma, you had a family doctor that was saying, man, this is a really bad flu season here, and people are really starting to die. And you had someone in Oregon saying, God, it's a really bad flu season. And no one really realizes that what they were dealing with was something really different, and that should have been more aggressive containment. So I think the speed of information certainly worked against folks then. The world in 1919 had seen a lot of outbreaks and knew what they were, but the problem is that the 1919 flu epidemic didn't initially look different enough from seasonal flu. It was just a really bad flu strain. 1919, the problem was that it basically created a cytokine storm inside someone's body where your own sort of anti-inflammatory, your inflammatory proteins kind of attacked the body, and it killed a lot of really healthy people, which is, usually the flu is more deadly for people with compromised immune systems and people who are getting on in age. But this one was, people, my age, 40 years old and such, got really sick and passed away. So it was something a little different. But I think, we have a lot of things going for us now. I mean, the speed of information is a really good thing. We have a far more advanced healthcare system now. And we got some things against us, which is that we're more connected than ever before. And information to a certain extent can work against you too. I mean, it can really frighten people, which is it's a delicate balance to be, have a healthy understanding and then be, irrationally afraid.
You made an interesting point in the email that you sent me that it's a little bit out of whack that this is being measured by the effect on the stock market as opposed to actually focused on concern about people's lives. What do you see happening there?
Well, I guess my greatest concern has been it feels to me like there's a reluctance to act because actions might spook the stock market or cause people an economic panic. I mean, so they're taking what I consider to be very tentative steps, and it's sort of like don't make any radical action because if people think we're getting a big outbreak and a big pandemic, then they stop spending money and the economy slows down and things get so bad. But I think, from my standpoint, I think that's sort of like playing to win, but I don't think you should be playing to win with a pandemic. You should be planning for the worst case scenario because, the reality is dead consumers don't buy anything and dead employees don't go to work. So, it's a little, I have to really shake my head sometimes. I mean, I think my feeling or my preference would be to go ahead and prepare for the worst. I mean, do these things, They're doing the quarantine, which I think is good. I think we should be prepping the hospitals and preparing staff for an outbreak. We ought to be ordering more of these tests, stockpiling masks if we need to, and fast-tracking, research into a vaccine and fast-tracking research into these treatments. I mean, if you prepare for the worst and then things aren't as bad, hey, I think it's okay. If the stock market goes down for 3 or 4 months, but you save more lives, I mean, I choose that option, frankly. I don't buy into the idea that if the stock market goes down, the world is over. I mean, the stock market just recovers afterwards.
Yeah.
But if you've lost a lot of lives, then those families are, they're, irreversibly changed.
If you were advising a presidential candidate in the current season to speak in a presidential way about the topic, what might you imagine someone saying from a debate stage or another forum?
Well, to me, I think it should be treated like what it is, which is a natural disaster. I mean, we've seen a natural disaster hitting China and you see the human cost and the economic cost, and it feels like in America we're just sort of watching this storm on the horizon, and we're saying, stay calm, it's going to dissipate before it hits our shore. I don't think that's the case here. I mean, I think the virus is a mindless organism that does the one thing that it's programmed to do, which is amplify and replicate itself. And it's going to do that in any territory where it can gain traction. It doesn't care about national borders or politics or anything like that. So the coronavirus, in my estimation, is likely to have a big effect on the U.S. And I think talking about it in clear, frank terms with the American people is the approach to take, and preparing for it, even if it means the stock market is going to go down. I mean, I think, in short, like I said, it's a natural disaster soon to hit our homeland, and more action should be taken.
Right. Well, let's finish up with an update on your writing. Your Long Winter trilogy, I think that was your last completed work. Can you say anything about what's next and timeline and different approaches to what you're doing?
Yeah, I'm working on a few things. Like you said, the Long Winter concluded last year. And I've written an epilogue to the Lost Colony, which is the third book in the Long Winter, and it's in edits right now. The story's about, I think it's 7,500 words, so it's it's a lot long. It's a 30-page epilogue, so it's a lot longer story than I thought it was going to be, which sometimes happens. So that's going to come out, but that will be on my website. It'll be free to readers and
great.
The email subscribers. And then I've got about half of a new novel, which needs a good bit more work, but it's about a group of strangers who wake up in a underground bunker and discover that they're part of a trial to restart the human race, that the human race has undergone some mysterious apocalypse and that they are the key to the future. And they're racing against time to try to figure out, what are they involved in and what is the key to sort of restoring humanity and bring us back.
Huh. Is there a title for that yet?
I have a working title, but I'm not sure it'll be the final title.
Yeah. That strikes me as a natural progression from your interest in some of the interpersonal dynamics in the solar war and people trapped out in space and how they get along. So are you kind of focusing right in on that point in this novel as the central theme?
Definitely, yeah. I mean, I think it's got that. It's got a little of what all of my sort of work has, which is these strangers that are kind of brought together by circumstances who don't always agree, but have to kind of put their personal differences aside and work together. And I mean, that's kind of like what the world feels like these days. But, and the issues are kind of bigger than their personal issues. And then along the way, they sort of. I think they learn a lot about themselves and hopefully a lot about the folks next to them that didn't know before.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like it'll be a timely book. And
I hope so. Yeah.
Are you hoping to get that one finished into readers this year or probably next year?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, some of that will depend on the audiobook publisher. And then my UK publisher, the UK have a print-only deal. They've kind of encouraged me to hold the books back so we can synchronize releases. So I have to kind of submit, as you know, the Long Winter books were held back for quite a while to try to synchronize releases. And I do want to do that. I mean, I think the audiobook readers, I get a lot of fan mail saying, hey, when's the audiobook coming? So I want to try to get everybody together.
Yeah. Good. Anything else that you'd like to mention about pandemics or health in general?
Well, I would say, just to folks out there, exercise caution and, try not to worry, but also be cognizant. And for those folks that have, individuals in your family or close friends that might be in a vulnerable population, I think those are the ones to be super mindful of. I mean, those are where the mortality rate's probably going to be a lot higher, and this could be a life-changing event.
We've got a birthday party for my father tomorrow. He's going to be 93 in a couple of days, and the family's gathering. Good idea not to shake his hand, or just be careful of touching him even at a kind of a family party like that?
What I would say is, if I were you, I would wash my hands before I shake his hand.
Yeah.
I think it's absolutely a good idea to shake his hand, give him a hug, and you should be fine as long as you exercise caution. Because I know you've been, you've been traveling a bit and meeting a bunch of folks. So I would definitely exercise caution.
Yeah, good. I've been speaking with A G Riddle, author of Pandemic and Other Science-Based Thrillers. Thanks very much, Jerry.
Thanks for having me.
That's it for this week. My guest next week is going to be Bradley Metrock, producer of the excellent Digital Book World Conference, which is coming up later this year in Nashville. He's going to be talking about the bold protest that he made of Macmillan's new restrictive policies regarding the availability of ebooks to public libraries. And he has said that Macmillan employees will not be able to attend Digital Book World as long as these new restrictive policies aimed at libraries are in effect. So I'm really looking forward to having him on the show so we can talk about this whole process and the developments in ebook lending. I know I try to separate my political activity from the Kindle Chronicles, and I do have other ways to talk about it online if you're interested. Unfortunately, we've been so busy here in Las Vegas that I haven't done any new episodes of the Edgecast podcast, which you can find in the podcast app on your iPhone. We might be able to get something up later, but it's just moving too quickly to do that. So other than Instagram photos, and I guess those show up in my Facebook feed, the way that I'm keeping track of our adventures here is mainly my morning journal flash briefing for Alexa. And if you're interested in that, it's not always political, but when we're doing something right in the midst of it, then that's pretty much what my life is about. And each morning that I've been working out down in the Bally's Fitness Center, there's a quiet area where I can record some thoughts about the previous day's activity and what's ahead. To listen to that on your Alexa devices, you can also use your Alexa app to do this. Simply enable Morning Journal. So you would say, Alexa, enable Morning Journal. And then if you say on any day or any time, Alexa, what's new, then my Morning Journal flash briefing will be presented to you. If you're also listening to other flash briefings like news sources like BBC, NPR, Fox, the Morning Journal will sort of flow in amidst those other ones. I generally am putting them up at around 6 or 6:30 a.m. Pacific time, and so that they're showing up later on the East Coast than they usually do, and I can't do one more than 5 minutes. And I find that an intriguing parameter to try to figure out what I'm going to say in 5 minutes is a good test of clarity and being concise. And I have developed a practice of doing these where I sit for 10 minutes, I set a timer on my watch, and just let my thoughts settle and try to figure out what would be worth sharing with the subscribers or the followers of what's going on. Darlene just sent me a text that showed up on my screen here. She's knocking on doors today, and I am going to be driving members of the campaign staff to various places in the Las Vegas area throughout the day. And I've got a report for my first pickup in about an hour and a half. That's going to be fun. My goal in that work is going to be no conversations with anybody about the campaign or the election, or that my focus is going to be getting people safely to where they're supposed to go and showing up everywhere on time. So I'm going to have kind of a Zen practice of being nothing but a driver. But I'm very excited to have a chance to help out in this new way. And my feet get pretty tired when we're going door to door. We settled into a pattern where Darlene does most of the footwork and I move the car to the next house or get it close. And then when there's a chance to have a conversation at the door, I join her. And we've had some delightful discussions with people that when you get actually on the ground in a place like Nevada, which has a big role to play in the selecting of the Democratic nominee in this case, you see that people take it seriously, and we've had conversations that even though they didn't result in having somebody decide to caucus for our candidate, they're just memorable. There was a guy named Jimmy, an African-American guy, 89 years old, sitting in a chair in his garage, just enjoying the fresh air on a beautiful Nevada day. And he was pretty clearly for one of the other candidates, but he just talked about the blessings of his life and what it felt like to be his age. And he was so appreciative that we'd come all the way from Boston to talk to him about a candidate that we believed in. And as he left, he said, "I'll pray for you, and I hope you'll pray for me." And I said I would, and I said a prayer for him as we went to the next house. And you read about the back and forth, and you watch the debates and everything seems so kind of sharp and knife edged. One camp against the other, but on the ground, it's just a very different situation. It's human. It's person to person, and some of my favorite conversations have been with representatives of other campaigns that I've run into, and they very quickly become not the enemy, and even not the competitors. They just become people who, for their own reasons in their own lives, have decided to support a candidate the way we're supporting ours. And it's calming, it's peaceful to see that for all its flaws and imperfections, and we were in Iowa for the Iowa caucuses, this comes down to individual people in a democracy talking with each other and doing work toward electing a president that hopefully is the right president for the time. And I know there are people on the Trump side that feel the same way, and I'm certainly I haven't strayed from being a partisan here, but I have enlarged my sense of this process, and it's been very energizing. I have to say, at 69, I find myself learning new things and meeting new people and having a chance to participate in the life of this country in a way that I just haven't had a chance to before. We've done work on other campaigns, but this one at this time seems a little bit more intense, and we've got the freedom and the ability to participate in these very important early events, like we were in Iowa, and I've done door-to-door in New Hampshire as well, and now we're in Nevada. We might take a break and knock on some doors in Colorado leading up to the March 3rd contest, but I have a feeling both of us want to get to South Carolina just to see what it's going to be like on the ground there, and the last of the early voting states that command attention as individual states before a third of the delegates are chosen on Super Tuesday, March 3rd. So that's. I hope you found the information from Jerry Riddle helpful. I know I did, and I've been washing my hands and trying to pay attention to this. It really feels like a distant rumble at this point as to what's coming our way from China, where the outbreak occurred. But I'm pretty sure that the months ahead are going to be very much dominated by the reality of this outbreak and the efforts of people who are risking their lives, pretty clearly, as Jerry said, to keep the damage and the toll of this outbreak to minimize it as much as possible. So, a lot going on, and I'll be able to put this up on the nets and head out to do some driving here in Las Vegas. This is Len Edgerly for the Kindle Chronicles from Las Vegas, Nevada. Thanks for listening. Bye.